Hey team, welcome to Civics. I'm very excited to be able to teach all of you this unit, not just those individuals that I did not see for the ethics unit. That was, of course, part of the initial plan. Humanities teachers, ninth grade humanities teachers, all of us thought that we needed to reconsider how we teach this unit and who teaches this unit. Just because if we had sort of proceeded as planned, it would have meant that you would have, that one of your teachers would not have seen you for the remainder of the year, because we are really ending this term with civics unit. So I'm happy that we could sort of redesign this, so I get to be with all of you. It's important to me. Okay, so for this screencast, I'd like to accomplish a few things. So first off, I'd like to just indicate what our essential question is that we're really looking at. There's some confusing terms that I'd like to define at the outset, which will sort of help us to understand not just the essential question, but some of the language moving forward and some of the concepts moving forward. I'd like to indicate briefly what these founding documents are, and then I'd like to set them in their historical context so we can have, I guess, a deeper appreciation for what these documents meant at the time. Not just what they mean for us today, but understanding how they emerged in the 18th century. Okay, we're going to move forward. As we move forward, I would ask that you make sure you have your key terms chart out. This is on Schoology. You might pause this and look for it if you haven't seen it yet. But there are terms and they're coded in different colors. For this screencast, we are looking at the colors in red. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe I alphabetized the terms. They don't necessarily come in order of the screencast. So as I go through the screencast, you might pause, make notes, and the things I ask you are, what does the term mean? Why is it important? The latter might be more difficult to answer for some terms. For instance, terms related to the essential question, it might be a little more difficult to define. Terms that discuss key events or people or documents, these certainly I should make clear why these are important, and you can sort of relay that information. You may also add your own thoughts, and I invite that. Okay, so we're going to move forward. Make sure you have that key terms thing out, and let's roll. Okay, essential question for the unit. How does change occur in a federal republic? Federal republic is a system of government that we have here in the United States. You might also hear constitutional republic. I think it's important to underscore this term, federal, which can be confusing. But let's break down some of these terms. Beginning with republic. A republic is a system of government that includes elected officials. So, in other words, people, citizens, are allowed to put people into office. And that's important because it also means that people have the ability to put other people in office, right? So if you put an individual in office and they are not reflecting the interests that they said they would reflect, or your interests, maybe your interests change, there is a way to put different people in office. It's the importance of voting in a republic. You gotta vote. So republic, elected officials are in place to represent the needs of the people and execute positive change. Federalism. This is a system of government that recognizes different spheres of activity. Okay, so for instance, there is a national government. The president is a part of the national government. There is also a state government. Governor Inslee. He is sort of the executive branch, as the president is, but for the state. All right? So sometimes there are disagreements between national and state governments. For instance, on marijuana laws. Legal in this state, not legal at the federal level. Okay? So federalism means that there's collaboration, but there's also some contests that exist as well. And we see this with COVID as well. The visions of the national government may or may not be consistent with the visions of the state governments. There are other governments as well, right? Cities, counties. This is federalism. Okay, federal. Federal refers to national. So as I mentioned, Donald Trump being the president of our national government, you could substitute federal there, all right? Federal government refers to things national. So the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, okay, this is our national police force. It's not related to state or city or county. This is national. Okay, so when you hear federal money, this is money that's coming from the national government. All right, federal. Federalist, this is a term that refers to a specific individual. For our purposes, an individual in the 18th century, one of the framers of the Constitution. This is an individual that, among other things, supported a strong central government. All right, that sounds like empire language. And it really is. So, for instance, a federalist might suggest that the term of a president should not be set. So when you elect a president, they are president for life. All right. So you can see how that's a strong central element to a government. An anti-federalist, someone that is more interested in state or local rights, autonomy, might suggest a 2-year term for a president. Right. So limited power for central government. All right. Ultimately, what we get in our Constitution, and this is for our next screencast, are compromises. All right, we have a 4-year limit, but a federalist would support big government. All right, I just say this because these 3 terms look a whole lot alike, and they are actually quite a bit different as you sort of get into them. Okay. Let me take you through this presentation here. This is what we're attempting to accomplish. I think I indicated this already, but what are the founding documents? There are 3 of them, maybe 3.5. There's another document that I'll discuss that is important, but no longer is instructive for us today, but an important document once upon a time. So what are the founding documents, and what are the big sort of events that led up to the Constitutional Convention? This is the assembly of important people who got together and developed our Constitution in Philadelphia in that hot summer of 1787. All right. The founding documents in a nutshell. All right, we have the Declaration of Independence. This is much shorter than the Constitution. And it's essentially states to Britain that the colonies are no longer just that, a colony. They are an independent nation. And as you can imagine, with any sort of breakup, there are a list of grievances. Okay, Constitution. So since we are no longer adhering to this form of government, that is that of the United Kingdom, we are developing our own. And the Constitution is that document that spells out the structures of government. there is a concern that among some individuals, particularly anti-federalists, that as you set up a new system, what you're essentially doing is you're getting rid of one form of tyranny and you are establishing another. So there was a great interest, particularly among anti-federalists, that it be identified what personal freedoms exist for those citizens of those nations. All right? And that's the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments, and we'll talk about that more in the future. But these are the three big documents here: Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Documents 1 and 3, as you can see, pretty brief. The Constitution is the one document that we'll not read in its entirety. It's a little bit lengthier, and as you can predict, as it develops sort of structure of government, there's a lot of jargon and difficult terms. Nevertheless, we'll explore what it's really saying, the anatomy of this document as well. It's enormously important. Okay, these are our documents. So, the following documents is a developing relationship. I kind of already indicated the Declaration of Independence and what that is. That's the breakup, all right? What's next? You need new rules. You know what's coming. You know what's coming. New rules. All right. These are the new rules that are in place. We have severed ties with United Kingdom. We're developing new rules. But wait. All right. I need protections. So this new relationship doesn't treat me as badly as the previous relationships, right? Because I'm concerned about that. So there is sort of a dialogue that exists now with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. On the one hand, providing a structure. That's the bottom arrow. It provides a structure. But at the same time, the Bill of Rights, the top arrow, is indicating that while there is a structure, there nevertheless are these basic human freedoms, and the Constitution protects these. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at our timeline here. The big blue stars represent our three founding documents: Declaration of Independence, 1776. 1789, we have the ratification of the Constitution, and then 1791, the ratification of the Bill of Rights. What I'd like to do is spend some time on the smaller white stars. These smaller white stars also indicate important events. Okay, so we're beginning our narrative here with 1765. What happened then? The Stamp Act. This is significant because the British government will ultimately assign a tax specifically toward colonists. Okay? This is a tax that people in the United Kingdom and other colonies that belonged to the empire did not pay. It was only paid for by the colonists in what would be the United States. We need to keep in mind that colonists considered themselves British citizens, and because they were being targeted for this tax, really found it unconstitutional that they had to pay a tax that others didn't. Well, what was the tax? The tax was really for any sort of commercial or legal papers. So if there was some legal paperwork that they needed to do, they needed to pay a tax on that. If they were purchasing something that had paper, and it could be newspapers, pamphlets, it could be playing cards, all these things included a tax. It did not include toilet paper because they did not use toilet paper. They used, does anyone know what they used? They used a corn cob. Okay. So they did not use toilet paper. Toilet paper would be more of a 19th century, not an 18th century thing. This also might explain why I couldn't find any corn at the grocery store the other day. Okay, that's a joke, actually. All right. Before I move on, actually, the image on the left is the insignia of the stamp. The image on the right was published several months after the Stamp Act was passed in October 1765 in I think the Pennsylvania Journal, so a Pennsylvania newspaper. All right, let's move on. Another event that you no doubt have heard about, this happened now a handful of years after the Stamp Act, is the Boston Massacre. So at this time in Boston, you had under 20,000, maybe closer to 16,000 residents in Boston. Along with these 16,000-ish residents, you had 2,000 British soldiers. So that were essentially keeping the city in line, because there were some smaller riots and general discontentment with respect to not just the Stamp Act, but what would be other taxes as well. So the Boston Massacre, this happened on March 5th, 1770. There's almost a mythology about this event, so I'm not going to really explore the whole range of theories on how this started, but in short, colonists were antagonizing a lone British soldier. I think there's general consensus that it started with pelting them with snowballs. Snowballs escalated perhaps to clubs. Shots were fired, and I use the passive voice here because it's not completely clear which British soldier shot, if it happened incidentally, if it happened purposefully, if someone gave an order. Ultimately, 5 people would die. Among individuals who would die is a really important person. His name is Crispus Adams. He's an African-American gentleman who born into slavery, also mother, I believe, was indigenous American, so he's a mixed race individual. He ran away from slavery successfully, in fact. Became a sailor, did a number of things, it sounds like. He was an individual who was also shot and killed here, and is generally regarded as the first casualty of the American Revolution. The American Revolution officially won't start for another 5 years, but if we think of it more broadly, American Revolution as a series of aggressive actions between the colonists and Britain, I think it's a fair characterization to call Crispus Attucks that. And he would die. He was not, his funeral ended up being, in one contemporary's estimation, the largest funeral that they had seen, with more than 2,000 people gathering to pay honor to this gentleman. He was not generally regarded, not completely regarded in a positive light. For instance, our second president, John Adams, considered Crispus Attucks an antagonizer, and really blamed the whole event on his antagonism. We do not know Crispus Attucks' role within that, but I can see how this sort of represents the beginning of a legacy in which African Americans are actually identified as causes for antagonism, mob violences. But Crispus Attucks, an important individual and an important African. And to be quite honest, there are not many names and identities associated with enslaved Americans. And the fact that we have this is pretty cool. All right. All right. Our next event in this series of important events is the Boston Tea Party. And if you aren't completely familiar with what happened at the Boston Tea Party, you no doubt have at least heard this name. This is the event by which a group of individuals, a part of a revolutionary group called the Sons of Liberty, all right? Not a motorcycle gang. I know it kind of sounds like that. The Sons of Liberty dumped 342 chests of tea into Griffin's Wharf in Boston. This group, the Sons of Liberty, a number of famous people, you no doubt hear the name Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, individual, right? Give me liberty or give me death. Paul Revere, the Redcoats are coming. Another individual, an important member of this group, Benedict Arnold, all right? He'll ultimately become probably the most infamous, notorious traitor in the history of our nation. You're looking at the picture and you're saying, I don't see any colonists engaging in nefarious activities, but I do see a bunch of indigenous peoples. And yes, that's what you're seeing. The members of the Sons of Liberty actually dressed up as indigenous peoples as they conducted these nefarious acts. All right. This is a significant event for a number of reasons. Probably most importantly, this is the first major coordinated act of defiance against the British Empire. There will be others. All right, as you can imagine, the response of the British Crown was swift and punitive. They installed a series of acts that the colonists called the intolerable acts, beginning with the need to repay for all that tea that was dumped. And again, in George Washington's mind, wasted tea. All right. You can see this cartoon, this political cartoon. It's showing a woman who is representative of the colonies being force-fed this bitter tea. The bitter tea is called the Boston Port Bill, and that was the bill that required repayment of what would be about $1 million in today's money for all that tea that was dumped. It wasn't just that. There were other measures that were taken. For instance, a quartering act, which allowed, and this is something that ended in 1770, but was reinstalled, was this idea that British troops could be housed in the houses of colonists. There were other measures taken, such as Boston lost the ability to elect their officials. The British Crown appointed officials. And as you can imagine, they didn't necessarily represent the interests of the colonists. If colonists have grievances, that was another act that was passed. It would not be taken at a local court, but the court would be taken to the United Kingdom. So that's where that would take place if you had a grievance with a local official. So not really viable to travel to the UK, and also understanding that you're not really going to get a fair trial in the UK for colonial grievances against people appointed by the UK, right? So a number of things happened, and this is just really leading us toward the Revolutionary War, which will officially begin at the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. During this time, in this wartime, there was a need for greater collaboration and unity among the different colonies. So they put what is really ends up to be sort of a precursor to the Constitution, which is a document called the Articles of Confederation. And it identified a shared body, a Congress, and they could establish treaties and to some extent, conduct trade. Not to a large extent. That was part of the one of the deficits. But this is the first sort of document that laid the foundation for the unity of the colonies. Not just separate colonies, but ones that work in collaboration with one another. The war would last until 1783. The Articles of Confederation, again, if the document was great, there wouldn't have been a need for a constitution. But it was weak. And the deficits and the problems with respect to the Articles of Confederation were really made evident in an event, really a series of events called Sheas Rebellion. Sheas Rebellion, Daniel Sheas, starting with the person that the event is named after, was a revolutionary, a retired revolutionary soldier and farmer. I believe he fought at Bunker Hill, among other big battles. And he was really discontent with the little compensation that he had received, coupled with a large taxation that the farmers were having to pay in Boston. So what he did was he organized a number of other farmers and many ex-soldiers, 600 in total, to protest at different courthouses. When their needs weren't being met, the protests turned to more escalations, and ultimately, not 600, but 1,200 men would storm the arsenal, and that's sort of a tried and true method for revolution. If you want to take over a part of the city, you're best to go where all the weapons are stored, so they attempted to do that. Ultimately, even though there were 1,200 men, I say only, but of course it's unfortunate, only 2 deaths, 20 ended up being wounded. What are the lessons from Sheas Rebellion? One of the lessons is, as a country or an emerging nation, the colonies needed to be able to produce an army that could properly respond to these sorts of insurrections or rebellions, like Sheas Rebellion. That was a problem. There was not a professional army at this time. If there were concerns in the city, the lawyers, the merchants, the farmers, all these people had to get into military mode. There was not a standing professional army that could respond to problems. And part of this is because of the Articles of Confederation. Armies obviously cost money, and the Articles of Confederation didn't outline a way by which they could tax different colonies in order to make this important defensive army necessary. A professional standing army that could be called into action very quickly. So interestingly enough, when we do get the Constitution, one of the main reasons for the development of this professional army is not to fight the British, but actually to control disgruntled colonists, which is pretty interesting. Okay. Ultimately, in 1787, we will get the Constitutional Convention, the reconsideration of the Articles of Confederation. Some people thought they would just be tweaking the Articles of Confederation. Some wanted sweeping overhauls. This gentleman here, really interesting person, Gouverneur Morris, probably the most prolific speaker at the convention. You can see he's got a peg leg, which is obviously kind of cool. He didn't marry until he was probably close to 60. I think he ended up marrying his housekeeper. Lots of just peculiar, strange things about this individual. His brother was a British general. His sisters married loyalists, that is, people who were loyal to the crown. So he had sort of a divided family. He ultimately and sadly would die from complications to a self-surgery he attempted to conduct involving a whalebone. Governor Morris, there you have it. So I'm going to sort of table all of this here, but we are working toward the Constitutional Convention, which we will pick up next time. See ya.